it's just all about me. That's good. Let's do that.
So
yeah,
I think that
and we can stop recording after. After
I'll tell you all you need to know. If you want to know
so
about
now
Lee,
that we've seen all my glory, I don't want to like break the recording. So Rob, why don't you go ahead and
So I lived in China for 10 years. I was an English teacher for 7 of those. And then from 2009 to 12, I got a Chinese government scholarship to do a master's degree at Nankai University in Tianjin. And there I studied modern and contemporary Chinese literature. I wrote about the poet Haizi for my master's thesis. That was that's how Ivan and I started exchanging emails about Haizi. That was an absolutely brutal experience because the whole thing was in Chinese, including the writing of the master's thesis and everything, which is as hard as it sounds. Don't come away from that comment thinking I was just merrily typing in Chinese. It was 6 to 7 hours a day of just destroying my brain trying to compose this in Chinese. It was very hard. I got into the University of Oregon in 2000. I was supposed to start in 2012, but I met the woman who was going to later be my wife that same year, and we started dating. We met in China. And I went, I don't want to leave now. I would rather see if I can stay here. And so I wrote to the department that accepted me and didn't explain why, just said, hey, could I maybe start a year later? And they said, sure, why not?
Yes. I didn't know that.
Yeah. I told you that. You didn't know it?
No, I did not.
For your information, the reason they were so excited to have me start a year late is because they typically accept more people than they can fund, because people tend to everyone drops out except for about 4. But the year I accepted, like 8 people had all said yes. And they were like, we don't have enough money for this. And so when I dropped out, they were like, oh, yes. So anyway, started a year later. I studied comparative literature. Lee and I have had many fruitful arguments and jokes at various departments' expenses over the years. The conventional wisdom, at least in the US universities, is that national languages tend to be very, very conservative and boring, and comparative literature tends to be all over the place with no depth whatsoever. That's sort of the stereotype. Right?
Everything is a comparison.
Everything can be compared to everything on any level, and in national languages, unless you can show me the period on the page that you are quoting, I won't believe anything you say. So anyway, that's the stereotype, but we've had a lot of fun with that. I wrote my dissertation on translations of French literature to Chinese. I am now living in France, not writing about that, but I am working on a long critical translation of a late Qing philosophical text by Wang Guowei. And Lee and I are working on a book. Slowly but surely, on a book.
I haven't heard from you for a time. It's on museums or about media, right? On China, media. How it is represented in news and so on.
Yeah. It's the stories behind the major headlines. So what's the
stories behind the story?
Yeah. Yes.
You can also text all notable names, texts, or projects that you involved into the chat, and so everyone can see. So I want to ask our students if they have any questions about your life experience, about your career, and maybe we just focus on that today.
Sure, we can do that. I mean, Lee and I like talking about whatever. So we can talk about China. We could talk about Chinese literature. We could talk about me and my genius. We can talk about any number.
It'd be a very short conversation.
It'd be a very short topic, exactly. we'll be in and out in a couple of seconds. It'd be great.
Ivan, if they want to ask questions, should they do it verbally or through the chat?
Yeah, I think verbally it's fine, but I don't see any function of like raise a hand or.
Let me see, because I might have to do something with that. Ivan, can I make you a co-host?
I'll be honored.
Because I think that
Please in
might.
there.
It's rather rare. I'm using Zoom these days. Like, well,
So you should be able to.
Yeah, just at least I don't see this function yet. Like, well, if anyone has a question, he can just directly ask it. I think verbally, it's fine.
Sure, but some people are not comfortable until they're used to talking with us, so they can start out.
Yeah, or just text it to the chat. We are fine with both variants, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
I'm co-host right now, but I don't see what has changed.
It gives you a lot of ability to do other things. So if someone raises their hand, I think you can ask to unmute people.
Yeah, if everyone's muted, that's going to be tricky.
Yeah. Well, since we it seems that we haven't got any questions yet, so we could move on to our main topic. I mean,
sorry, Ivan.
Literature.
Ivan,
or
someone's trying to talk
directly with
hang on, Ivan. Someone was asking a question.
I can say that we're just not very used to talking about Chinese literature, especially in English, so it might be a little bit difficult. I know that there were some questions about science fiction in China. I think it is a very interesting topic, so if we could discuss it, it would be great.
I love science fiction. Lee and I, another of our disagreements here.
Somebody has texted that.
Yeah. So out of curiosity, hang on just a second, let me clarify, Lee. Before we answer the question, do you yourself, looks like this is Arina? Am I reading the name right? Is that
yes,
the person
Arina.
Arina, yeah.
I studied Russian for like months, so I can actually read some of the letters, but please don't say anything to me in Russian because it's going to go completely over my head. I can read your name and that's as much as I can do. So anyway, but do you yourself enjoy reading science fiction?
I love science fiction, but I haven't read anything Chinese about science fiction.
Okay. I ask because I love science fiction and I have read a lot of it. Lee and I will likely have slightly different answers on this one because I love it. Lee hates it or says he hates it. He hates some of it anyway. But we have started talking about it more because Chinese science fiction is one of the few aspects of Chinese arts that really is internationally renowned. Liu Cixin famously won the Hugo and Nebula Awards for his novel Three Body Problem. Several different Chinese novels have won major awards. And if you read enough of it, it's a fascinating blend because it's very different than what's coming out of the United States. I have only read a handful of Russian science fiction novels, so I couldn't say how it differs from Russia. But one of the things that I've noticed about it is that it tends to read like much older science fiction. And by older, I don't mean boring, but Lee and I, for example, just discussed a story called Year of the Rat by Chen Qiufan. And that story could easily have been written in the 1950s in the US. It's what we call oh, here we go. Well, we'll get to Dadia's in a minute. And that's a great question, by the way. But it's a near future science fiction story about a group of military people hunting down genetically engineered rats. But it's also a very, very dark and sometimes funny political satire. That kind of thing is not the sort of science fiction novel Americans are writing right now, but it is what we were writing a long time ago, except that Chen Qiufan's version of it is very different than anything we've done. So it's a really interesting combination of very old and very new. And I think that's something unique to Chinese science fiction that the US hasn't had in a very long time. And I also think that's one of the reasons why it's winning so many awards, because people are realizing, wow, this is the kind of stuff that used to make science fiction super interesting, and we've just sort of forgotten about it. Did you have something you wanted to say, Lee?
Yeah, I guess a couple of things. So I found that story that, so I'm not a fan of contemporary American science fiction. Rob's absolutely correct on that. I do enjoy some older forms of American science fiction, like Vonnegut and George Orwell. If you would even consider that science fiction, I think maybe you can. I'm not entirely sure that everyone would be comfortable saying that, but certainly I like Chen Qiufan's Year of the Rat and some of the other stories in that collection that Ken Liu has translated, Invisible Planets, and I thought that Year of the Rat was really interesting because it does engage in this kind of political debate. It's science fiction, I think, is one of the few places in Chinese literature where you can be open about politics because it's considered science fiction and it's so speculative. I think that the censors who normally ban these kinds of discussions and other forms of literature don't really care. I'm not sure why, because it does seem extremely political. But I that's what I like about contemporary, or at least that story. So I don't like Liu Cixin. And Rob, that I think we just have a difference of perspectives. Obviously, like, he's really popular. I was talking to someone while in the gym a couple of days ago about Liu Cixin, and a third person randomly walked over and entered our conversation, and he said, "Are you talking about Three Body Problem? I love that novel." So like this novel has generated a lot of interest in the US. And I think that the reason I'm not a huge fan of it is because I don't like what's called world building. A lot of science fiction today is in America is about like building these really interesting worlds. I really like I like craft in terms of writing. I like narrative. I like good plot. One of my favorite authors is J.K. Rowling, and Rob and I both really like her Harry Potter series. And we were talking about why we liked it, and Rob and I like it for totally different reasons. Rob really likes the world building, the way she kind of builds this imaginary space. I actually think she's a great writer in terms of plot. Like, everything she does is just perfect in terms of her structuring of the plot. I think that might be one of the reasons why Rob and I differ over Liu Cixin. I also wanted to add, I don't know how many of y'all are familiar with this, but there is actually quite a bit of science fiction being written in the late Qing. So Liang Qichao actually wrote a book. I just happen to have it here. It's on it's called 信中国未来记, 信中国未来记, and I'll put that in the comments in a second. But it's a record of New China, and it's a look at China in 2062, and it begins with a speech from one of the men descended from Confucius, giving a speech at the Shanghai World Fair, speaking in Chinese to everybody. The Emperor of England, the Emperor of Russia, And it's fascinating because everybody in the world speaks Chinese, because China is now in 2062 the most powerful country in the world. And so there was an interesting moment in the late Qing where science fiction actually became very important. And it became a space for Chinese writers to imagine a China that wasn't under colonial domination. I actually wrote part of my dissertation about a passage on museums in goodness gracious, Rob, help me out. It's not Kang Youwei, it's Wu Jianren.
Well,
Huh?
yeah.
Wu Jianren's.
You wrote about Kanye also.
Yeah. So Wu Jianren's story of the news story of the stone, Xin Shitou Ji. It's a continuation novel of the original Hong Lemeng, the Dream of the Red Chamber, also called Story of the Stone. And in it, Jia Baoyu goes from being this kind of, in the original novel, of course, he's just this guy who kind of lays about in his garden, making love to all of these women. Now he becomes this nationalistic figure wandering around Shanghai and Beijing, complaining about how foreigners are subjugating Chinese people. And then he enters into this utopian space where it's both modern and Chinese, and he, Wu Jianren, the author, says this, that he's essentially trying to imagine a place that can be both. And in it, he goes into a museum, and that's the passage that I discussed. But what's fascinating is that it has all the tropes you would expect from science fiction, but it's very much an artifact of a past time. You have, when he goes into this utopian space, Jia Baoyu has to pass through something like a metal detector. It's, like a metal detector, but it doesn't detect metal. It detects virtue, Confucian virtue. And so like people who are good can walk through there without like setting off the alarm. Whereas people who are kind of bad have to they set off the alarm, but they just have to wait there for a couple of days and reform themselves. Whereas people who are completely un-Confucian in terms of their virtue just can't enter. Yes, moral science fiction, exactly. So it's a fascinating read. I don't think it's been translated, has it, Rob?
Don't think so. It's not a very good novel, so I don't
know.
No,
it's not
to translate it.
But it is really interesting for what it says about China at the time and how they conceived both of the future of China, but also the past of China. And that's one of the things that I wrote about in a passage in there. Jia Baoyu joins with some friends, and they jump into a flying machine and go hunting the peng from Zhuangzi. And they actually hunted all the way to the west coast of Africa. And there's this interesting sense that, they're hunting, they kill it off of the coast of Africa. There's this interesting suggestion that maybe the Chinese in this utopian China of that's both modern and Chinese, maybe they can actually be colonialist as well. Maybe they can be like the British in Africa or the Germans in Africa and take control. I mean, it's not a very nice vision of like modern China. It's a China that dominates. It's a China that is imperialistic, at least implicitly. But it's really interesting. So, the question that you were asking about science fiction is interesting because there are really two completely different ways you could ask that question. You could approach science fiction from, okay, science fiction is what Rob was talking about. It's this modern thing that is interesting because it is winning all of these awards. But actually, there's this really bad version of science fiction that existed that's just as fascinating. Rob, I would almost say the late Qing science fiction is more fascinating.
No, I'm not going to give you that one. It's
fine.
It's more interesting in the way a building that is burning down is more interesting than a building that is standing up. Doesn't mean you'd want to go there. It just happens to be.
I don't like either of the buildings though, so I'm happy watching it burn down.
You do like some of the buildings because you've already said
Not
you
science
did, but
fiction.
yeah, you do. Vonnegut's science fiction. You like that.
Fair enough.
And you
fair
like
enough,
Star Wars. You call that science fiction. Anyway, we could go on and on with the debate. But anyway, suffice to say, it's an interesting genre in China. And it's one of the few, and I'm going to be done here because we've talked way too long about this. It's one of the very few where, well, it's one of the very few fun ways to write that's also highly respected and academic to do it. So some of the big science fiction writers in China are also notable professors of literature or history or culture in big Chinese universities, which is interesting, I think. Do you guys want to jump? Oh, geez, now you got me on the spot. I had one down the other day. What's her name? She's in the collection with Invisible Planets. Give me 2 seconds and I can find her for you.
While you're looking for that, Rob, should I turn to the question about women in Chinese literature?
Sure. Let me go.
So it's a fascinating question. The image of women in Chinese literature and their role in society.
Okay. Her name is Xia Jia. Well, there are many. I can find more names for you, but Xia Jia is one of them. She is, well, and actually Chen Qiufan is a multi-linguist and has taught at several different places. So anyway, but I can find more names later. This is just the two I can think of off the top of my head. So questions of women. Let's actually read the thing that's in the chat just so everyone knows where we're starting. How about that?
Sure, go for it.
So it says, I'd like to ask about the current state of oh wait, is that the one we started with? Oh, we actually have 2 comments. I almost missed it. Good evening, everyone. Also would like to learn more about the topic, the image of a woman in Chinese literature, the position and role of women in society, if viewed through the prism of literature, the transformation of the image in the minds of our time. It is also interesting to learn about Chinese literature that influenced cinema. So Lee, that's a lot. We're going to have to sort of corral our answers so that we don't talk for 45 minutes about each one.
It's a great question, though.
Wow. Yeah.
So I agree, Rob. We probably do have to kind of segment this. I think that you can start to talk about the image. The image of women is, women are kind of acted upon for a lot of Chinese literature. They don't really have any agency early on, but if you go back to like Ban Zhao, she's writing in the Eastern Han. I'm sorry, is it Ban Zhao? No, it's Ban Zhao. Yeah, I get them confused because there was a brother and sister. One of them's named Ban Zhao and one of them's named Ban Chao. But Ban Zhao wrote actually one of the earliest things that we have a record of written by a woman. It's the exemplary biographies of exemplary women. And it's a list of kind of women in Chinese history. Now she's writing in the Eastern Han, so we're talking about maybe 100 to 200 AD. And she's looking back at history from that point and coming up with examples of good women. In some ways, it's a very patriarchal move because she is only writing about women who are who fit the mold of the expectations of society. But she also, I mean, in her writing, she's doing something very interesting. She is giving some women a voice. And I think that that's really the first place where we see something interesting going on with women. Before that, I would argue that there's not really that much interesting to say about women in Chinese literature. I can't think of an example, at least Rob, maybe you can. But after that, you do have a little bit more agency for women, even though a lot of times in Chinese literature, women are understood to be kind of this they're definitely, you know, in the low, they're the lowest point on the hierarchy. There is a little bit more space for women. If you think about like the Tang, you do have some female poets. The Song, of course, one of the most famous poets of the Song is Li Qingjiao. She's one of the great voices of Chinese literature. And then you get to the modern era and that late Qing period that's really fascinating. And you start to have these women who are speaking up. Qiu Jin, who is she is, I'm not sure if y'all have encountered Qiu Jin at all. She doesn't write much. She goes to Japan and she starts experimenting with cross-dressing. She becomes a transvestite. She dresses up as a male. She takes on these male roles, very much a kind of proto-lesbian figure in the Chinese canon. And she goes back to China and is killed by the Qing dynasty fairly quickly. She's written a few things, but she is a really fascinating figure in terms of women's history and the image of women. And that there's a famous photograph of her dressed as a Japanese man that has circulated throughout discussions of image in China. I think that if I were to ask what's the most famous image of a woman in Chinese literature, it would be Qiu Jin dressed as a man. Rob, you disagree?
That's the most famous. If you look for women in Chinese literature, like, yes. I'll let Ivan talk.
I can't think of any more famous single image of a woman and a more discussed image of a particular woman and how that has affected our understandings of Chinese gender. I mean, it's certainly not standard. It's not normative.
No, I'm just curious because famous for like Chinese people would all have known who she was and are talking about him, or the circles that.
Sorry. In terms of academia, yeah.
Okay.
Good point. Sorry, I should have made that clear. Yeah, and I think that there might have been a brief period where where folks were able to discuss Qiu Jin in China, but today I imagine a lot of that space to discuss gender is closing up. And you know, like, she's certainly not representative of a lot of women. She's just, it's strange when you look at where China is today, and then you go back and you see Qiu Jin has already, like, some of the battles that they're still fighting today, Qiu Jin has actually fought those battles. And I don't want to say won because she was executed, but she, you know, she has made those statements about gender that were made. And I think Dingling is also a really important figure in terms of Chinese literature and women. Dingling is fascinating because she starts out writing about this kind of emancipated woman of the May 4th movement. And she throws in her lot with the communist, and she eventually gets silenced by communism. The Yan'an talks that Mao does in 1942, 43, what is it, Rob?
That would be 43.
So the Yan'an talks, where Mao essentially lays down the letter of the law and says, these are the way that literature is going to be written by communists. And that's going to last really until 1976. Those rules are kind of going to be more or less enforced until 1976. That's in response to a criticism partially made by Dingling. Dingling is in Yan'an, in the communist stronghold, and she criticizes Mao and lots of other figures in the Communist Party. She says, you know, men are judged based on their politics, whereas women are judged not on their politics, but who they're sleeping with. So women don't, she accuses Mao and others of saying, of implying that women don't have any agency of their own. It's only, their only agency is who they are sharing a bed with. And Mao takes that very personally and sort of shuts that whole conversation down. Rob, I think I should let you speak before I try and answer this question about literature and cinema.
Well, because we've already talked about this a long time now, probably been like 10 minutes about women, but I think what's interesting about the women in literature in the question that we were posed was, it's the image of a woman in Chinese literature, not necessarily Chinese women writers, because that makes it a much larger topic. And I'm going to confine myself just a couple of minutes because that way people don't get too bored. It's a Zoom chat. But there's a couple of instances that I find interesting. One of them being that women become something more powerful in some of the fantastic literature in China. When you read Pu Songling, for example, women don't necessarily always appear as mortal women. Sometimes they appear as fox spirits or fairies, or sometimes they're dangerous, sometimes they're virtuous, who knows? But they're by far the most exciting parts of Pu Songling's collection. They are the things that drive most of the plots. They're the things that are the most interesting about the plots. And although I wouldn't hold them up as sort of, this is what all Chinese literature up until that point thought of women, it's an interesting intervention because instead of, like Lee mentioned earlier, women sort of, they have to stay in the compound, they have to sort of be at home and do home things. Here there's something dangerous and interesting. What I think I wanted to point out is my thing to think about is that you could make a case for the moment when Chinese women become pretty much like men in literature is not in the May 4th era, it's in the Maoist era. That is not to say that the literature about women during the Maoist period in China was good, because it wasn't. But there's an effort made by communist writers in the 50s and 60s and early 70s to present women and men as being able to do all the same things, operate the same machines, march the same distances, think the same thoughts, things like this. Even before then, treatment of women is a little more tentative. There's a desire for women to be equal, but no one's really putting it much on the page. But the 50s, 60s, and 70s at least try to do that. And of course, once you get out of that era, we could talk for a long time about the more experimental literatures and what they do. But women become something altogether more experimental after the Maoist era. But the Maoist era is really where there's an effort to make women something like on the same plane as everyone else in society.
Rob, I actually think that the discussion that the image of Chinese women in the Maoist era is actually pretty not only important, but also very positive. I think that with the Maoist era, I think the sort of women's liberation movement hits a high point there. I think we've been kind of regressing in China since the 1970s, but that's just me.
Sure. That wasn't the be all end all. Yeah. We've got a bunch of stuff to deal with, so let's see if we can answer a few of these kind of a little more briefly. Chinese literature that influenced cinema, for example. That's a really large topic, but I'll give a sort of a quickie answer to that one, because I've been looking at a little more deeply some of the more recent Chinese films, popular films, that I think are referencing some newer stories. But until a certain point, the vast majority of really popular Chinese films are all about classics, right? So Journey to the West, The Three Kingdoms, Outlaws of the Marsh, or The Water Margin, especially Hong Lo Meng, Dream of Red Chambers. Hong Lo Meng in particular has, I think, 2 or 3 different TV series.
Sounds right.
Yeah, crazy stuff, right? But of course, if you're really wanting to get into the most popular stuff, you have to go martial arts fiction, right? I don't know if any of you have read Jin Yong, the wuxia writer,
The best-selling author of all time ever.
Ever. I mean, everyone I've ever met in China, I shouldn't say that, every guy I met in China,
there you go,
has read Jin Yong. Everyone, without exception, they all read Jin Yong. And there have been tons of movies made about his novels. And I don't know that I have anything necessarily to add about how good they are or the strategies involved. What I will say, and I'll hand it over to Lee, is that there's a trend in Chinese filmmaking in the last 10 or 15 years that I notice that I think is very interesting. And that is that they have finally started not trying to copy what Hollywood is doing in the US, but they're using the tools that Hollywood used to do their own versions of things, right? So they're beginning to take old stories and do with them what Hollywood maybe would have done, but they're doing it a little bit differently and in some ways better. So I'm really curious to see what kinds of literature they're going to bring up with that. Lee, what do you have? Lee's lost.
I'm here.
Okay.
Sorry about that. Yeah, I don't know if I would actually agree with that point, Rob. I actually think that to a certain degree in copying, I mean, if you think about the sort of Marshall McLuhan point that the medium is the message, I think that they're copying, or that the imitation of Hollywood films actually is a sort of, I mean, it almost seems like they have kind of been homogenized in terms of the kinds of films that they're making now. Yes, you know, like with the most recent blockbuster, is it Changjin Hu? Is that correct?
Battle of Lake Changjin Lake. Yeah, like
yeah. So you know, the bad guys and the good guys are different from what they would be in a Hollywood film. The message is very much pro kind of Chinese nationalism, but it seems like a very similar film to what you would be able to see in Hollywood otherwise.
I wasn't. Let me just clarify. I wasn't arguing this. This is, the world has never seen anything like this. But if you've seen Chinese films from the 80s, their ability, like, it's just a straight Xerox copy and not a good one of an older film.
I actually disagree with that. I think a lot of Chinese films in the 80s and 90s are, I mean, if you think about the sort of artist cinema, not necessarily pop film.
Right. No, I'm not talking about artist cinema. I'm just talking about the stuff that makes lots of money, the stuff that everyone wants. If we're going to, I feel like you do have to segment them a little bit, because if you're talking about Chinese film, it's a little bit like talking about Russian film or like American film. Like, what in the world does that mean? Like, there's the movies that everyone has been to see, and then the movies that no one has been to see, but is the good stuff, you know? Same thing with China, right? So yeah, if you're going to talk about Jia Zhangke and underground filmmaking in the early 90s, then we have a very different discussion. My point was that filmmakers that are trying to make a lot of money are a lot more confident than they used to be, and they're carrying off a lot of Hollywood tropes with a lot more panache than they used to be able to.
I'll only add to that a little bit. So the question was about how literature has imitated film, and I think you can see a lot of examples of that. Those artsy films that I was talking about, like Yellow Earth, Huang Tu. Yeah, that's a late 1980s film that kind of starts Chinese films advance in film circles. Like, before that, Chinese films had largely been ignored. After that, everybody was taking Chinese films seriously. You know, that is based on a novel. A lot of these others are based on novels. Red Sorghum is, of course, based on a Mo Yan novel. I also think it's interesting to ask how Chinese film has influenced Chinese literature. It hasn't entirely been one way, although most of the influence has been from literature to film. Some of it has actually been from film to literature. If you think about Zhang Ailing's Duo Xiaohen, it starts with a discussion of the protagonist going into a cinema, and the description of the story is very cinematic. If you look at some of those other Shanghai authors, Shi Zhicun is the one who particularly comes to mind. a lot of them seem almost like they're trying to write as if they're basing their stories or their novels off of a film. The Shanghai Fox Tribe by Mu, I forget his name. Mu, it's something. His family name is Mu.
Mu Shiyin.
Mu Shiyin, thank you, Mu Shiyin. You know, it's very episodic. It's not really clear what's happening. It almost seems like a kind of pastiche or something. It's one of those very innovative works. So both have influenced each other.
Yeah. We got a bunch of stuff here.
Yeah, what's the next question? These are great questions. Thank y'all.
Here's a good one. I'd like to ask about the current state of translation of Chinese literature in the US and France right now. What are the mainstream authors right now in these countries? Are American Chinese authors more popular, like Kevin Kwan, than native Chinese authors? And then also, could you please name some of your favorite Chinese contemporary novels, authors, and poets? That's an interesting one. State of translation. Well,
That's
I mean,
more
you could.
of your...
Well, I mean, kind of, yeah. But I mean, one of the things driving translated literature, at least in the U.S. market, is stuff like science fiction and fantasy. To take it back to our first question, I mean, love or hate Liu Cixin, after Liu Cixin, there was a much bigger demand for Chinese science fiction because that won so many awards that everyone went, wait a second, are you saying that there's more of this out there? And so that brought a lot more in. But what mainstream authors are popular in these countries? I can't really speak very much for France. I just got here, but I don't mix in the kind of circles where people are searching out Chinese literature.
Rob, how often have you been to the Sorbonne this year?
This time, none, zero. I've had no time. But in the US, I'd say a lot of sci-fi writers, Liu Cixin, Chen Qiufan. The question about American Chinese authors is an interesting one. And Lee, tell me what you think about this, but I think in our current political climate, most things to do with China are not super popular. Like it's not a American, like Chinese American or Chinese, either one. It's not like they're rocking up the bestseller list. Although I will say, what was the novel there's a novel called The Leavers. I'm going to write it down. You're going to have to give me a second while I get the information because it won a ton of awards recently and it's a big deal.
I would say that there is it's Lisa Ko, Rob. And I would say that there is this kind of movement in the US to make Chinese American authors a bit more popular. You've got Kevin Kwan, who is incredibly successful, of course, driven partially by the success of the film. I actually hated the film, but I think that those kinds of authors are becoming increasingly important. Amy Tan is probably the most famous Chinese American author. She wrote the Joy Luck Club. She's written a bunch of other interesting works. She kind of does her fiction is concerned with the particular travails of the Chinese American community and how they struggle to be accepted in the wider mainstream American community. She has some really good works that I would recommend to y'all that I like, Joy Luck Club being the best. In terms of Chinese authors writing in America, or Chinese authors being translated into America, I think that's, Rob, I think you're right. There is a little bit more resistance to that, although I think even that is getting opened up. I am, as Rob suggested, people in language and literature departments in the US are very much concerned with like the classics. And so I actually really like Zhang Ailing. She's still my favorite Chinese author. Lu Xun it would be my second favorite. In terms of contemporary authors, I have not actually kept up with them that closely. I probably should. If I were to point to one, it would probably be Moyen, although I'm not a huge fan of him stylistically. But that would be, I think, my favorite contemporary author. I don't know if you can call Zhang Ailing a contemporary author. She only died. I was alive when she died, so it
Typically,
counts,
if
right?
people stopped writing like 60 years ago, we don't usually count that as contemporary.
She continued writing.
Right, but if you say contemporary, that typically means stuff that's going on like right now. Like if someone says, "Tell me about some contemporary Chinese writers," you wouldn't say, "Let me tell you about Zhang Ailing." That's like a long time ago. Maybe you would. I wouldn't. I don't think Ivan would. Ivan's on my side. I think I can see from his eyes. I want to bring up something real quick that
Sorry,
Ivan.
Rob, I think Ivan was going to say something.
Go for it.
I just want to add that Zhang Ailing, as far as I know, she wrote her best stuff way before 90s, like in 40s and 50s. So
much longer.
Contemporary. Yeah.
So she actually, I think her best piece of work was Sijie, Lust, Caution, and that actually I think was written in the 60s. I think she was actually outside of China when she wrote that, if I remember correctly.
I wanted to touch on one thing. I want to touch on one quick thing before we get to another question. Go ahead, Ivan. You wanted to jump in.
Yeah, as far as I can recall, it was written in 50s and published in 70s.
That might be right, yeah.
Something like that. And it also was adapted as a movie.
Yeah.
By Ang
Lee, yeah.
Ang Lee, yeah.
Yeah. Great.
What I was going to add to this was, and this is something that Ivan and I were chatting about over email. In my experience, the vast majority of Chinese American and Chinese works that become popular in the US are resolutely political. Like they have to tell a story about a family being cast out by the communists and scrabbling to survive in America, for example, or it's several generations of families torn apart by the Civil War and the communists, or a family in America who experienced tons of racism, or like and this is not to slight some of these works, many of which are incredible, right? But there's a kind of Chinese story that Americans want to read. I think that's changing a little bit, but only a little bit. Like if you just look at a list of most popular Chinese American works, the vast majority of them are all like this. There are a handful that don't do that, but they typically don't get very popular. I think Americans tend to like novels that are basically give them a reason to say, see, that's why the Chinese government is evil, and
or to say that's why U.S. policy is racist, yeah. Right? Like there are very few scripts that Chinese novelists can read out, and there's a lot less space for them compared with mainstream American writers. I would say that this is kind of a ghettoization, is what we would say in the US of Chinese writers. I think that's true of all non-white writers to a certain degree in America, right, Rob?
Agreed. And I will say, just in closing, that is not true of the literary landscape in China, which is just every voice imaginable is writing stuff. Well, it's obviously with things cracking down a lot less so now, but in the last 30 years, it's just this explosion of different stories and voices. America tends to get about this much of it, and this much is in China. So it's a little unfortunate, actually. So the long-winded answer of the state of translation in the US is that it's not great because only a handful of things are actually being translated. Let's see. Hey, Ivan, how are we for time? Do we have time to get to another question or two, or are we starting to need to wrap it up?
Yeah, we have just one question left. That
Okay.
one about mythology. So we could you can talk about it for now, and maybe 20 or 30 minutes will be good, like for wrapping up.
Yes, but someone just threw a great question in there, which is, did COVID somehow influence Chinese literature? That's a great question. I'm not 100% sure I can answer that,
Yeah,
but
maybe we
great
go
question.
for these two,
Yeah.
and we're done, right?
Okay. All right. So this one says, good evening. Nice to meet you. I am very interested in Chinese mythology. That's because it's crazy and interesting, especially in its interpretation. It is, right? And if you've read Chinese mythology, you know what I'm talking about. You're like, what is happening in this story? I love it. Especially in its interpretations in Western literature of the 20th century. For example, this says the game of beads. One translation I've seen is the Glass Bead Game by Hermann Hesse, or The Man in the High Castle by Philip K. Dick, as well as in the poetry of Ezra Pound. Maybe you can recommend me more works that I could cover, or maybe on the contrary, works of Chinese literature in which Western mythology is reflected.
So I actually have an answer to that. I'm not entirely sure that this will whet your appetite, because I don't know if this person is willing to share it with you. But so a listener of ours of the podcast so he's a Jewish American who's living in Israel, and he is working on a rewriting of the Shioji, the Journey to the West, where Tong Monk discovers some Hebrew passage written in Chang'an, and he and Monkey and Pigsy all traveled to Israel, and there's a mixing of Hebrewic and Chinese mythological figures. It's he's still very much in the early stages of it, but it's a fascinating way to think about it. I kind of wonder, I mean, if you're interested in it, would it be possible to write a Journey to the West where Tong Monk, Pigsy, and Monkey went to Russia and met with like Russian figures or something like? I mean, that's just a crazy idea. But if you're looking for a novel idea, I think you could do. You could have a lot of fun with that. Yeah, that's my short answer. Go ahead, Rob.
Yeah, I don't know if there's been a lot of Chinese mythology going into like Western fiction or film. I mean, depending on how you want to interpret mythology, the West's fascination with old kung fu stories is kind of close. It's more legends than mythology.
But I think that the influence of kung fu on American film has been pretty profound, and it definitely is a kind of mythology.
Sure. Well, again, depending on how you interpret mythology, mythology tends to involve creation myths and like the origins of things, and kung fu definitely has very little to do with the origins of things. I'm actually not sure that there's been that many. I mean, I see the Glass Bead Game, and I read the Glass Bead Game, and that definitely references Chinese philosophy in many, many places.
I'm looking for the name of it right now. There's actually a book by Rob, help me out. Who wrote On the Road? Jack Kerouac, right?
Jack Kerouac. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
You talking about Dharma Bum?
Yes, Dharma Bum incorporates lots of Chinese mythological or Chinese mythology and Chinese. It's more Chinese philosophy, but it is also some Chinese mythology. I'd recommend that. It's actually fairly well written. I can put it down in the chat. But that would be really the only thing that I've ever encountered where Chinese mythology has been referenced in American literature. But if there is something else out there.
American literature tends to reference philosophy and not so much mythology. But in terms of the reverse, works of Chinese literature, Western mythology is reflected. I would almost say the same thing. I think mythology is very culturally specific, and because it's at the base of whether we agree with it or not, how we read, how we define our cultures, it tends to be very proprietary. Like we don't share it. Legends are not. Like good stories are good stories, and let's share them around. But I do not see, for example, a lot of mentions of China's creation myths in anything I've ever seen in the West. Or biblical stories, for example, in the Chinese tradition. Maybe a few proverbs, or Lee and I and our mutual professor Roy Chan talked about a Lu Xun prose poem about Jesus Christ, but that's not really the same thing.
Rob, doesn't Heitze actually mention? Sorry, Ivan, go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to add that the guy who started typing rebellion was influenced by the Bible. So
yeah, he famously thought he was Jesus's half brother.
Yeah, and he also wrote some stuff, right? Like declaration of a new society or a new country or a new regime.
It sounds correct. I don't actually know that I've read it though. Rob, have you?
I have not. No, I have not.
Yeah.
I could be wrong.
You're probably right. I think that just so many of those documents from the Qing dynasty don't get read today. I'm actually kind of disturbed. In American academia, John Fairbanks is the guy. He was at Harvard, and he did all of these studies on Qing dynasty history and Qing dynasty documents. And there has, since the 1960s, 1970s, there's been this leftist turn away from John Fairbanks. Fairbanks was the claim that American academics make today is that John Fairbanks was, working for the American elite to help perpetuate imperialism in Asia. And you had these students in the 1960s and 1970s who are now just retiring. But when they were young, they said, we're going to reject John Fairbanks and a lot of what he stood for. And I think that has actually come to, that has damaged some of the American study of Chinese literature and Chinese history, because you have a lot of interesting scholarship that he and others like him did in the 50s and 60s that has been ignored. So I think that the documents that you were talking about are something that John Fairbanks probably translated something by him in the Taiping Tianguo, but it just might not have come across Rob and my radar because of this kind of turn against John Fairbanks. The thing that I was going to ask Rob, Heitze in his long poems, his crazy poems, uses a lot of references to Jesus and Greco-Roman mythology, doesn't he?
Yes. So that's an interesting usage. It looked like the question was more focusing on fiction, but Heitze would be a little like an Ezra Pound character, sort of an outlier. I'm not familiar with many other writers of his generation that were trying to bring all of that stuff together in one place.
Yes.
Let's see. Heitze Taiyang. Yeah, seriously. All right.
Should we turn to the COVID question, Rob?
If you've got something to offer, that's why I said it's a great question. I mean, it has to have, right? I mean, I'll see how I do that, but I'm not sure now.
I think it's too early to say how COVID has influenced Chinese literature. I think, go, Ivan?
Yeah, because the time I've begun to work on my current dissertation, I was considering this topic about COVID and modern contemporary Chinese poetry. I've searched for a while, and I've found the book by ex-Misty poet Yan Li. He published an anthology of COVID poetry in New York already. Like he published it in 2020, like the year before. So the reaction of discourse is pretty quick.
That's true.
Is it any
Well,
good?
China has a history of publishing poetry pretty quickly related to current events. I mean, that's
Dufu, right?
Yeah.
That's what Dufu is about.
Dufu, yeah. There's several collections of worker poetry of, Chinese workers writing about just stuff every day. So,
Ivan, is that collection any good?
I haven't read it because it hasn't got this digital copy yet. Maybe it is on Google Books already. I don't know, because I've just switched my focus and.
Yeah,
Okay.
that makes sense.
Which I think that it's probably a little early to say what effect COVID will have on Chinese literature. I'm not sure. Rob, do you think it's had any effect on English language literature yet?
I don't know. Last year or so in my dissertation, I was in tunnel vision mode. I did not read a whole lot that wasn't related to my dissertation, so I would not be the best person to ask about that.
I know that a lot of novels did get published, or people, when they were on lockdown, did start or finish novels that they had been working on. So I wouldn't be surprised if, in terms of the publishing output, you saw something like a bump in terms of quality.
I will say that there's been a huge surge in the sales of science fiction and fantasy. So you could possibly link that to COVID, saying, when the world is dark and disturbed outside and you're trapped inside, it makes sense to imagine someplace totally different to go to, right? That would seem to almost be logical.
Ivan, should we start to wrap it up?
I think it is time.
Yeah.
We have a really fruitful conversation today.
Yeah, thank you so much for your great questions.
Yeah, I believe you get some more listeners from Russia starting today.
We hope. And great questions, everybody. That's always fun talking about solid questions.
Yeah, some weird emails, just stay tuned.
Please do email us. We love emails.
Yeah.
Maybe you should post your email address.
Rob, do you want to do that?
Sure. Oh, why did my keyboard just switch to French? Just a second.
Mine was in Chinese.
There we go.
So everyone who is interested in, you can just email on this address anytime, any weather.
And the person who was asking, the student who was asking about mythology, if you're interested, I could put you in contact with the person who's working on that novel that melds Hebrew and the Journey to the West, Hebrew mythology and the Journey to the West. I don't have permission to share his work with you, but he certainly might be interested.
Yeah,
I know he's looking for more readers, so
he is a current PhD student.
No. He's just a listener to the podcast who lives in Israel, in Haifa.
Yeah, he's working. I forget what industry he's working in, but yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you. I will be happy if it is possible.
Thank you for tuning in.
All right. I think that it's getting fairly late for y'all. Rob, it's also close to your bedtime, isn't it?
Well, it's time for me to put my kids to bed. Yes.
Thank y'all so much for listening to us babble on.
Yes. Thank you.
And I want to wish you a Merry Christmas. It will be really soon.
Yeah, Merry Christmas.
Western world in a week.
Yeah,
That's right. Oh, that's
Great.
right. Y'all are still 3 weeks. It's in January for y'all, isn't it?
That's right.
Yeah, it's 7th. Is January is the 7th.
Hmm.
So
Interesting.
it was fun, and I'm happy that everyone could make it.
Yes.
Yeah.
Sleep well, everyone.
Yes. Night.
Yeah.
See ya.
Bye.
Good night, everybody.